So what I wanted to do is just share several examples that come from, sort of several aspects of the work that I do. As Sunshine mentioned, I'm the Climate Adaptation Coordinator for WCS's North America program. So I work with staff and colleagues and our partners in a number of different landscapes. All of these green blobs here in the US and Canada are places where WCS has ongoing climate change science, planning, and implementation projects. And actually also up in Arctic Beringia, we span part of Arctic Russia, Alaska, and Canada up there. But then I'm also going to be sharing some examples from the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund, which is a grant program that WCS administers with funding from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. And we invest in projects that are doing on-the-ground implementation of climate adaptation strategies. And so I'm lucky to have Darren Long, who's the head of our program here in the second row, and Catherine Dunning, who's the head of our communications for the grant program. So I will share a handful of examples from the work that WCS and many other organizations are doing. And I encourage you to ask us about additional stories that might be going on in your neck of the woods, depending on where you're coming from. But again, the Climate Adaptation Fund invests in on-the-ground implementation of adaptation strategies. And over the last 4 years, we've invested over $7 million in 41 different projects. And we're not, we're specifically looking for projects that help to create a diverse portfolio of stories that are ambassadors for applied climate adaptation to help inspire others to think about ways that they might approach thinking about climate impacts in their systems. So like I said, I wanted to just share a handful of examples of adaptation in practice. And I'll talk about them sort of as they address some particular climate-related challenges, similar to how Laura framed some of these issues. So how many of you all here are writing about areas that are likely to be experiencing decreased water availability, increasing drought, increasing aridity? I work a lot in the Intermountain West, so this is really a driving issue of concern for many of us working in conservation. And one of the strategies that I think is really exciting that people are trying to put into practice right now are efforts to try and restore the natural water storage capacity of ecosystems in order to do a couple of things. One is to offset some of those snowpack declines. So right now, a lot of the water in the west, especially in the mountainous west, is stored in snowpacks. And then those snowpacks slowly melt out and feed those stream systems over the course of the summer. But as those snowpacks decline, we want to try and think about ways, and we have more precipitation falling as rain in the wintertime, think about ways that we can store that water in other parts of the watershed and in the ecosystem to balance out some of the loss of snowpack storage. And ultimately try and help maximize the water use efficiency and the retention of water in ecosystems so that they're available for plants and wildlife to use. So there's a number of ways that people are trying to sort of look at how ecosystems are able to store water. The first comes from a project that we're supporting that's led by the American Rivers, and they're working in mid-elevation and higher elevation wet meadows in California and the Sierra Nevada. And their approach is to sort of take these unhealthy meadows and restore the functions so that they act more like a sponge. And I'll use that analogy a lot with these examples, trying to increase the sponge effect, if you will, of these ecosystems. And by improving the function of those wetlands, they're able to slow down the flow of water through the system, reduce the sort of deep channelization that's happening in a lot of places, get more of that water to percolate into the soil, percolate into the water table, percolate down into groundwater supplies, so that they're more available for the long term for those ecosystems. Another strategy people are using to increase the sponge effect of watersheds is by restoring our good friend, the beaver. A lot of places that have had beaver extirpated have seen real degradation of the ecological functions of those wetland ecosystems. And so we're supporting through the Climate Adaptation Fund 2 main projects. One is in the Metcalf Valley in Washington, and then Grand Canyon Trust has been restoring beaver in southern Utah along with a number of partners. And again, by bringing beaver back into the landscape, they'll put in those dams that help to create ponds and wetlands, again, that are natural sponges in these ecosystems. But as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, not everybody is willing to accept beaver in their backyard or in the neighboring lands. And so there's a lot of conflict between landowners and beaver. And so other strategies that WCS is employing is to actually go out and do the work of beavers ourselves. So this is my colleague Jeff Burrell. He's the head of WCS's Greater Yellowstone and Northern Rockies program. And he's working with Sonny Napton over there, who is the head of the Madison River Water Conservation District, and they are busy being beavers. They're building dams that are meant to mimic the kinds of dams that beavers build. And they're semi-permeable, so they're not intended to make ponds or large wetland areas with these structures, but they are intended to slow the flows down, retain that water in the ecosystem, raise the water tables, which allows that riparian vegetation to be able to come back and thrive. Here's just sort of a snapshot of what we're seeing, and it may be a little hard to tell with the colors on this screen, but this is a stream where Jeff has been installing beaver dams. This is, I think he started late in 2012, so this is what the stream looked like. It had some riparian vegetation along it, but otherwise pretty dry around it. And over in this picture, what we can see are some of the effects of the dams that he's put in 2 years later. So you can see there's a little bit more green. The riparian area is wider. There's new channels, these side channels that have not been activated for a long, long time that are now reactivated and growing vegetation. And so you can kind of start to see the effects of those dams in influencing the quantity of water that's available for plant growth in these systems. Another kind of approach to looking at how water is used by end users, but also again thinking about the role of ecosystems in storing water, comes from some work that is being implemented by a rancher in southwest Montana. His name is Eric Kalsta. And this is his ranch. It's a ranch that's been in his family for many generations. Ranching is his livelihood. So he's not somebody who is a conservation land buyer who has the luxury of, sort of his investments to fall back on. This is really where he needs to make a living. But he also happens to be somebody who's the perfect kind of partner for us because he genuinely cares about the wildlife habitat values of his property. He has journals, family journals that go back 100 years, and they talk about sort of the hip-high grasses and the growth of vegetation there that is very different. It's been degraded through the ranching practices over the years, and he really wants to try and sort of restore those habitat values. And one of the things that Eric is doing in this landscape is taking an innovative approach to how he does irrigation. It used to be a flood irrigated fields, but over the last several decades, people have really made a move towards these center pivot irrigation systems because they're known to be more efficient in terms of the amount of water that they extract and distribute across the landscape. But what Eric noticed is that when he got rid of the flood irrigation, there was a whole line of shrubs alongside his fields here that provided bird habitat, cover for his cattle during the winter, but also are important connectivity linkages for wildlife moving through and across his property. And he was really disappointed that his switch to sprinkler irrigation lost some of those habitat features. So he's now tinkering with the idea of allowing his fields to flood when the rivers are bank full or higher. So when there's a lot of water flushing through the system in the spring, and we expect to see more of those springtime floods as climate changes, he'll be able to spread that water out across his fields, allow it to sort of recharge the groundwater supplies and return flows back to the river later in the summer as flows naturally go down. At which point he'll switch to the sprinkler irrigation because it's a more efficient use of water. So we're still doing a lot of research to try and understand the net benefits to his ranching operations, to the streams, to wildlife that use these habitats. But it's a sort of an interesting way to sort of tinker with the system and try and match his irrigation practices to what the water system is going to be doing as climate changes. Eric is also playing around with, so this field up here you can see is a pretty dry field, and normally during rain events the rain just sort of rushes off the surface, erodes the soils off the surface. It doesn't percolate down and allow for much water for plant growth. So Eric has gone in and built these kind of contour structures. It's a ditch followed by a mound, and it follows along the contours of the landscape as shown in this picture, so that when those surface flows come down, it gets trapped in the ditches. And he's seeing, for the first time, it's a little hard to tell in these pictures because it was taken in late summer, but he's seeing grass growing on those fields that he hasn't seen grow in decades, just from putting in these contour ditches. And then lastly, he is playing around with, and some other projects that WCS is funding in a number of other landscapes, but especially down in Gunnison, Colorado, building these rock structures. So these are little rock weir dams in a dry gully that again also has some of those surface water flows that happen during rain events, in order to try and slow down those flows and trap it so it soaks down into the water table and kind of creates moist soils for plant growth. And then in Colorado, the Nature Conservancy has been leading a project again where they're installing rock structures in these sage steppe habitats in the riparian areas so that they can improve the quality of the brood rearing habitat for sage grouse and other sage steppe species. So just some really interesting strategies for trying to, again, boost the water retention within these ecosystems as they are exposed to more warming and drying, so that hopefully they stay the relatively wet places within an otherwise dry landscape. So those are a handful of examples that all sort of relate to water storage. I had a few other examples, and so I'll try to go through them pretty quickly. But related to sort of how we manage ecological changes. So as we talked about, there are some species that may do poorly under future climate conditions and other species that may do better. So how do we take that into account in our management? Well, there's a couple things we can do. We can actually take actions that are intended to benefit those species that we think are likely to thrive under future conditions. And we can also try to actually facilitate some of those ecosystem changes. And so with coastal ecosystems, we can actually see some examples where groups are trying to facilitate the inland migration of those coastal habitats. And so one example of the first sort of changing species composition comes from work by the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota. This is a project that we fund through the Climate Adaptation Fund, where they're implementing what they call adaptation forestry, where after a harvest, they're looking closely at the planting list of species, the tree species that they include in their plantings. And whereas in the past, those plantings were really focused on species that used to be there and have historically thrived, they're now trying to boost up the representation of species that are currently part of the system, but a relatively minor component of the system today, but are expected to do better as conditions warm and get drier. And so again, they're trying to sort of help shape the future trajectory of that forest ecosystem so that it hopefully fundamentally stays a forest habitat, even if the tree species are changing. So I think it's just a really interesting example of, again, trying to sort of shape that curve rather than prevent the change, trying to shape that change. And then some other examples come from these coastal ecosystems, including this one, which is one of the coastal examples, a project that's being led by Scenic Hudson, where they're working in the Hudson River on these, I always have to catch the freshwater tidal wetlands. And what they're doing is they're protecting land, not where those wetlands are today, but further inland from those wetlands, so that they're purchasing those lands, putting easement on those lands, so they can help facilitate the transitions as these water levels rise and these areas become inundated. The future areas are available for those marshes to migrate inland. And another example, if this is in an area where some of you might be working, is at the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, which is in Maryland. And they're, again, trying to prepare these lands that are further inland for these coastal salt marshes to be able to move in as sea level rises. So a real kind of rapid run through a handful of examples of some things that I think are pretty exciting that are underway as part of our grant program or that WCS is directly involved in. And so like I mentioned, we have lots of other information. Catherine may have a few handouts about some of the projects that we're supporting through the Climate Adaptation Fund. But again, they cover a lot of different geographies within the US, a lot of different climate impacts, a lot of different kinds of ecosystems. So hopefully if there's a particular area you're working in and you want some examples of projects going on in your neck of the woods, hopefully we'll have some for you. So thanks.